All right, so thanks again for having me. And as Tom said today, what I'd like to talk about is my research on long distance social connections. During today's talk, I'll use social connections, ties, and relationships interchangeably because depending on what literature you're familiar with, there's often different terms that are used. Okay, so when we talk about human social systems, we're often thinking local, particularly if we are, say, evolutionary anthropologists or even social scientists. What we're often doing is thinking about a focal person, say ego, and the local social network in which they're embedded. So evolutionary anthropologists have been traditionally quite interested in what's happening in households, in cooperative breeding, for example. So sharing resources between aunts, uncles, grandparents, and children, all of those family members. And sometimes we think a little bit further out, we might think about neighbors, colleagues, friends, things like that. But oftentimes when we're doing social science, not just evolutionary anthropology, we're often not thinking about social relationships at a distance. And those can actually be pretty important for human sociality, as I'm going to talk about today. So it ends up that humans have actually been doing long distance relationships, Ldrs, as I'm going to abbreviate them, for a long time. So depending on whether you look at bonobos or chimpanzees as an analogy for our last shared common ancestor with them, so about 5 to 7 million years ago, it looks like that basically these long distance relationships were at least solidified in the human lineage. So for chimpanzees, very rarely do you have any inter-community behavior, any community relationships at all. For bonobos, you actually do have relationships that span what we will call community boundaries, but it's unclear whether these individuals are related or not. Humans, on the other hand, by about 300,000 years ago, we have durable material evidence from the archaeological record of traded goods moving really long distances, sometimes 50, 100 kilometers, even further. And by at least 10,000 years ago, by the end of the late Pleistocene, we see evidence for human sociality having lots of long distance relationships, lots of movement between groups, for example, and again, using archaeological data to suggest that. So humans have been doing this for quite a long time, even though we're not really focused on it. And even though we're not necessarily looking for them, these relationships often pop out in the data that we collect. So I mentioned the archaeological record, again, durable goods, things like obsidian points and other arrowheads from the US context. These are examples from the Southwest. The ethnographic record captures a lot of long distance relationships, particularly with the movement of goods or with marriage partners. I won't talk too much about the institutions that reinforce long distance relationships today, but of course, when there are benefits to doing something, humans will usually find an institution to make it cheaper and easier. And additionally, long distance relationships often pop up in social network data. If we're going for complete networks, we'll often miss these. And even if we're going for egocentric networks, sometimes we cut them off to make our models fit better when we're doing our statistics. But oftentimes you can see what Jamie Jones calls these little porcupine quills sticking out of human social networks. And those are often long distance relationships. So long distance relationships are not necessarily what you're thinking of, depending on what kind of tradition you're coming from in terms of, say, social science, or maybe you have a social network background. So long distance relationships are not what is currently being studied as a long tie. So if you've heard of long ties, what these basically mean is they mean that you have a connection between two nodes, here we'll say two individuals, that actually spans a few different ties in the middle. So over here, you'll see this tie range is basically 2 because you're catching 2 different ties there between these 2 focal individuals and this third party. So that's being spanned by this one tie. And this over here on the right-hand side is what you would call a long-range tie, where you have 2 individuals who are connected, and there's not a lot of other mutual connections except for this kind of long chain of different ties between nodes of length 6, basically, between the 2. What's interesting about long ties, if you haven't heard about them before, is that they tend to be pretty strong. And by that, I don't mean a strong tie, but what I mean is that they tend to be reinforced through a lot of phone calls, visiting, Twitter activity, things like that. Now, the thing about long ties is they're actually somewhat orthogonal to long distance ties. So this is from a paper by Patrick Park et al. From 2018. It's actually from the supplement. And what Pat and others show is basically that you have this difference between tie range, where you see this very kind of consistent U-shaped curve in their data, where the call volume, for example, here we're looking at phone calls, tends to be higher for really close ties, those that share a lot of mutual connections, and those long range ties over here on the right-hand side, and distance. So if we're looking on the left-hand side, we actually see that call volume tends to be a little higher between individuals who have a medium tie range, but are living further apart. We actually see the opposite relationship on this side in Rwanda. The left-hand side is the EU, where you see individuals who are further apart have lower call volume. This is all to say that this seems to be two different phenomena we're looking at. Long ties are not the same thing as long distance ties. Something else that long distance ties, long distance relationships are not, are intergroup relationships. Now, of course, they can overlap. You often have long distance relationships that do span ethnic boundaries, that do span religious boundaries, and of course span communities, but they don't have to. And this is a mistake that I made earlier on in my career, where I was conflating the two before I realized that they can actually easily be pulled apart. So looking here at data from Bolivia that I collected among the Interculturales and the Mocetenes, I won't be talking about my Bolivian data much today, but feel free to check it out on my website. I have all these articles linked. What we see for these two communities, the Interculturales and Mocetenes, is that about half of households are headed by a couple who's often from two different ethnic groups. So half of households, for example, speak Spanish as the lingua franca, even though they may come from two different ethno-linguistic backgrounds. So you see a lot of intermarriage between different ethnic groups, but intergroup relationships may or may not characterize these long distance relationships. So looking here at the right-hand side, when I asked individuals who would help you find a good job that pays well, you can see that there's this big scatter in how far away folks are looking for tips on a good job. Information transmission is one thing that long distance relationships are really good for. And these folks, when I asked them, the participants had a really hard time often naming their ethnic group. So what we're seeing here is this disconnect, right, between long distance ties and intergroup ties. You have a lot of intergroup ties happening at a local level. These long distance ties may or may not span ethnic boundaries. Sometimes they do, when people could actually answer the question, and sometimes they don't. So bringing this together, long distance relationships are actually conceptually distinct. Oftentimes in the literature, we've been implicitly conflating them as intergroup relationships, or as what's now becoming popular as long ties in the social network literature. But while a long distance relationship can be a long tie, right, so where you can actually have very few mutual connections between two individuals, and it can span distance. And while it of course can be an intergroup tie, it need not be either. So why did long distance relationships become integral to human sociality? Why do they start popping up everywhere, for example, before 10,000 years ago? And the evidence suggests that long distance relationships are an important way for managing risk for humans. So the human way of making a living, sometimes what we call the human niche, involves a lot of correlated risk. So here, just one example of high frequency, high amplitude resource shortfalls. That's this kind of big movement you see here. Shortfalls are often compounding in space and time. So in climate science, these are often referred to now as temporally compounding or spatially compounding events when we're thinking about climate change. And this is very common for climate and for the environment in general. And it's especially something that plagues humans, as we'll see in a slide. I think it's the next one. So as Pete says, for example, small surprises are routine for humans, but big surprises are not so rare. And these have been shaping human evolution. And of course, human sociality is part of that. So humans have a lot of strategies for managing these autocorrelated resource shortfalls, whether they're temporally autocorrelated or spatially autocorrelated. And here I'm drawing from ideas that emerged in archaeology in the 1980s and have resurfaced several times since then. But these are 6 different strategies that were identified. There are more, of course, but 6 main strategies that often emerge to deal with environmental variability for humans. It can include everything from force, which we often think about as raiding or even as theft. It can happen, of course, locally in the same community. Savings, which include money, and of course, also storing foods. Diversification, whether it's of your portfolio, literally, if you're investing, or of what plants you're growing, or of what animals you're raising. Risk pooling, which can happen at the community level or between communities as well. Exchange and mobility, which can be short-term and long-term, at which point we might start calling it migration. So these are all cultural adaptations, right? These are all things that have emerged in multiple different groups around the world. If there's been a lot of sharing of these ideas between cultural groups, they're subject to cultural evolution. We'll come back to that. Now, these bottom 3, risk pooling, exchange, and mobility, often can involve long distance relationships, partners who are living at a distance. They don't have to, but they can. And we see lots of evidence for that in the way people are moving around today, the way they're sharing money, thinking about, for example, sending money back to countries where your family is located. There's lots of ways that humans are doing this. So of course, the question then becomes, how long is long when you're thinking about long distance relationships? How far away do partners need to be to have less correlated risk? And of course, this just depends on the degree of autocorrelation, whether we're talking about spatial or temporal autocorrelation. So just a simple mock-up here that Jamie Jones and I have done. If you're interested in Jamie's name, he'll come up many times today. His name, of course, is James Holland Jones. He publishes under that, so feel free to Google him. So the autocorrelation function here that we're looking at varies across these 4. And on the x-axis here, we have distance, and this is just a mock-up. But as you can see, the degree to which autocorrelation declines is going to vary with that autocorrelation function. And that's going to depend on the resources we're interested in. We can think about just a single resource, which of course is the easy way to do things. But oftentimes for humans, you have multiple resources we're relying on together, right? We have that diversified portfolio of things that we're using to make a living. So that function, what we tend to call the characteristic scale of risk, is something that individuals face. We can actually establish that by asking them, which is something we're trying to do in a project that I'll mention later on. And what this characteristic scale of risk reflects is, of course, the local ecology and also the way that people are making a living. The characteristic scale of risk looks pretty different for agriculturalists, especially intensive agriculturalists, than it does for, say, foragers. So how far away they need to be will depend on the local ecology and mode of production, and we can actually ask people this when we're working with living people. So the characteristic scale of risk for humans can be quite large. So oftentimes when we're thinking again about the evolutionary anthropology literature, we're often thinking about managing risk locally. So we spend a lot of time focusing on things that, for example, can be foraged or hunted, and things that can be gardened. So pulling here from a paper by Adrian Yegi et al. In 2016, when folks are often managing risk in terms of, say, having a bad return one day or one season, they're often doing this with folks who live close by. So garden foods are often managed within a household context or nearby households among neighbors. Hunted foods, at least neighbors or among the same community, that is the same folks who tend to be living in physical proximity. If you start looking at other things that have been rough for humans in the past, things like water, which we need a fair amount of, and salt, which is pretty important to the human diet, and places like the Amazon can be really hard to come by, these are often really far away, right? So if we're thinking about the sun, for example, Polly Wiesner's touched on work on this. Oftentimes folks are moving at least 30 kilometers away, if not 100 kilometers away, to access water when water is in short supply. And salt can be far over 100 kilometers away in places like the Amazon. So the characteristic scale of risk can be quite large for humans, and it depends on the resources we're talking about. So in terms of the 6 strategies that I mentioned earlier, or any other for that matter that's not on that list, of course, we can do a cost-benefit analysis in terms of what strategies we expect individuals to use. And when it comes to long distance relationships, here are a few of the relevant costs. So the cost of long distance relationships can include the cost of gifts and time spent visiting. For example, the Park et al. Paper I mentioned earlier shows, and a more recent preprint actually, which I also have cited earlier in the talk, shows that folks often have to spend more time investing in these long ties, which may or may not be long distance ties as we established, but in these long ties because there's not a lot of mutual connections. Same thing with long distance ties, right? I mean, if you're living at a distance, you don't run into each other every day. And so it takes a little bit of extra effort to keep these going. Anyone who's reconnected with high school friends on Facebook knows that it's more than just becoming friends. You actually have to direct message, have some interactions, things like that. So gift giving, time spent visiting or in communication, if it's on social media, for example, or on the phone. The risks of visiting. So if you are traveling across distance and encountering strangers, which is something we may have encountered frequently in the past, there's of course a cost that can be inflicted in terms of a risk to your own life by going to someplace else to visit. It's difficult to monitor long distance relationships. So when you're working with someone as a social partner who's in your immediate community, it's easier to keep track of their behavior if they decide to free ride, right, to renege on your relationship. If favors are not reciprocated, it's much harder at long range. And the opportunity cost, of course, may exist for not investing in local relationships. And this is something my postdoc, Chris Smith, and I are actually looking at. Is it true that long distance relationships are, in fact, more difficult to monitor, and that there's a trade-off in terms of opportunity costs between investing in local relationships and in long distance relationships? So we would assume this a priori, but this is something we're actually checking empirically. So when might paying these costs of long distance relationships actually be worth it? What are the benefits and how often do they have to occur? So first thing I want to say is I'm going to talk about negatively skewed distribution with the fat tail. The tail over on this distribution is not nearly fat enough, but I'd like you to just imagine that this line is a little bit further above the x-axis than it actually is. So paying the cost of long distance relationships might be worth it when returns are locally correlated, whether that's spatially, that's especially what we're thinking about here, but temporally can also come into play, and negatively skewed with a fat tail. So again, thinking about this in terms of resource availability on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis, if you think about resource availability as generally being pretty high, but you have a fat tail of low resource availability, meaning it's happening relatively frequently, it might be worth investing in long distance relationships. Of course, if that tail is less fat, meaning that you have these big shocks coming in less frequently in terms of resource availability, this is often when we might expect humans to have emergency responses in the sense of maybe engaging in raiding or engaging in migration that wasn't planned. So not going to some place where you know someone, which is often how we see migration happening, but instead going someplace brand new under duress, basically. So we can think of examples of this, for example, in the historical or archaeological record. One of my favorites to think about is California, thinking of the medieval climatic anomaly and how Californian groups basically suddenly engaged in raiding because the social connections they had weren't quite cutting it in the face of this big shock to the system. So long distance relationships have been central to human responses to climate variability and climate change, as we've just seen, right? So thinking about climate variability, just for starters, when you have these little blips, right, that happen very frequently for humans seasonally, that's important. We also, as Pete points out, right, have these big shocks that are not so rare. This is characteristic of climate variability, but is also characteristic of climate change. We will continue to be in the context, we will continue to see this in the context of contemporary climate change as we're going forward. So in this next section, what I'd like to talk about is the application of long distance relationships and thinking about them in terms of how they structure human sociality in the context of contemporary climate change. So what I'd like to do first is introduce you to two different teams who are working on this. I'm heading both with Jamie Jones, who I mentioned earlier. And I'm going to refer to these groups as Team 1, Team 2. You might see some familiar faces here. But Team 1 currently is really focusing on theoretical questions. And team 2, while we're interested in the theoretical, we're focused on getting a grant first and foremost, so we can collect some empirical data, which I'll be talking about later. So when I refer to team 1 and team 2, these will be the 2 teams, and the folks here down this middle line are on both of them. So first of all, let's establish something. What is climate change adaptation? If you're paying attention to the news or to podcasts these days, you'll hear adaptation thrown around a lot. It's the current favorite word on Science Friday, if anyone listens to that. And the thing about climate change adaptation is it's very underspecified. In fact, a new study came out showing that the public doesn't really know what adaptation means. So looking around at all these different websites, a really quick Google can show you lots of different leads on climate adaptation, climate change adaptation, adaptation and mitigation. When do they overlap? When do they not? Lots of different ways of talking about it. So even researchers are having a hard time nailing down exactly what adaptation means. But when you put it all together, and when you also think about a little bit where the evolutionary theorists are going to come in here, which is, of course, the angle I'm going to bring today, is that climate change adaptation, as it's being discussed in the literature, is change in response to or anticipation of climate change. Now, evolutionary history shows us that anticipation of something is not usually the best way to get something to evolve, right? Usually it's in response to something, but response to or in anticipation of is usually the way it's being used in climate science, among social scientists studying climate, and in the general public. So when people talk about climate change adaptation, they're often talking about cultural adaptation. So we've seen before, for example, these 6 kinds of adaptation that folks often use to respond to climate variability and climate risk. And development partners and governments often will promote some of these things, even though they don't often flag them as such, as cultural adaptation. So they'll provide funding for these things or try to intervene with communities, getting them to adopt them. So these include things like savings, right? Also things like insurance and risk pooling, very common, including microinsurance, so making small payments for farmers so that they have the ability to buffer risk when climate change effects strike them, and diversification of one's investments and of one's livelihood. But communities often already have their own adaptations to climate variability and climate change. And oftentimes we're not asking them what those adaptations are. Sometimes they're even framed in the climate literature as being inefficient and as not being a good use of time, which is why governments and climate partners often feel like they need to intervene. And of course, these can include any and all of the 6. Human societies have been mixing and matching these for a long time, depending on the costs and benefits. Climate change adaptations, regardless of which of the flavors of adaptation we're talking about, shape social networks. So of course, adaptation, if we're thinking like evolutionary theorists, it involves innovation. So you have to have variability coming from somewhere to actually have adaptations among which, or potential adaptations, I should say, among which to select. Filtering of what works and doesn't work. And importantly, modification, right? Which is really important, especially with cultural evolution. So what happens with local risk pooling for humans, which is something humans are really good at, right? And that's one of the quintessential features of being human, is that it can create interconnected clusters within networks. So if you're a social network person and you're looking over here at this network, what you can see is a pretty clear core. There's all these blue nodes that are connected together, and also a connected cluster over here on the side of a peripheral network, a peripheral part of the network, I should say. So risk pooling creates these interconnected clusters within networks. And what often happens is that long distance relationships, if we're thinking about these peripheral clusters like the purple over here, will often connect these peripheral clusters to cores. This is something that Maxime has been thinking about, Maxime Ldrs. Gosh, someone's got to help me say his name after this. Sidebar during Q&A. And of course, Rob Boyd have been working on this. Thinking about how these connections between peripheral clusters can actually allow innovations to emerge and to spread, right? And also thinking about how specifically they can spread to cores and how we maybe need to actually be paying attention to what's happening in the periphery of social networks to see what kinds of climate change adaptations might be out there, what we could potentially learn from when it comes to these peripheral groups. And long distance relationships between peripheral clusters themselves, between these kinds of clusters of purple around these big cores, permit selective adoption and modification of climate change adaptations. These are what are often called in the literature horizontal ties, and that's as true if you're working in the social network literature as it is if you're in the development sector. Horizontal ties are one of the flavors of the week in terms of how to get sustainable management to evolve, if you will. So how do long distance relationships structure social networks, and how does that change the very transmission of innovations in turn of these candidate climate change adaptations, or thinking more generally of cultural adaptations in general? So this is a mock-up from a grant that we're about to resubmit with Team 2. So thinking about how climate variability affects risk management, as we know it definitely does for humans, this is of course going to affect network structure. But we should then expect to see this feedback between network structure, the way transmission is happening, who's getting cultural information, how it's moving around, whether the cultural information in cores is swamping out what's happening on the periphery, all of these things, and how that then feeds back on risk management. So these three things should be talking to one another, and that should affect the way folks are responding to climate change today. So we're working as this group, again, Team 2, at 5 different sites around the world that are on the front lines of climate change. So this includes Canada, Puerto Rico, Ethiopia, Madagascar, and Fiji. And we're interested in what cultural adaptation to climate change looks like on the ground, and specifically how we see these feedbacks happening. So how social networks are changing in response to climate change adaptation, and how that is fueling the movement of climate change adaptations going forward. So this is a prospective study. And we're also interested in scaling up. In the climate research, we often see downscaling from these large climate models to what's happening locally. We're interested in going from the local to, say, the regional. Can we actually scale up from what's happening in local social networks to the movement of adaptations across larger regional networks? And further, can we actually upscale from the present to the past? We have 2 different archaeologists on our team, and our climate science researcher is also expert in paleoecology. Can we actually look at what's happening today and then project that back into the past? And we're particularly using Madagascar, Christina Douglas's field site, as a case study for checking that. So long distance relationships probably matter for responding to climate change, and we have a lot of data to suggest that. But another thing I'm interested in, and this remains to be determined for the most part, is whether long distance relationships affect the successful management of large common pool resources. So as common pool resources get larger, collective action gets more difficult. In case you're new to the collective, sorry, not to the collective action, to the common pool resource literature, a common pool resource is a resource that can be depleted, so it can run out, but it's really difficult to exclude people from using it. So some examples of common pool resources include things like forests, those often come up, grasslands, watersheds. It's hard to keep folks out of forests because they're large, it's hard to police the boundaries, it's easy to move around in there and not be particularly visible. But they can be depleted, right? You can cut down all the trees, you can reduce the value of what's out there for everybody else. Now, when it comes to managing common pool resources, there's a huge literature on this. Eleanor Ostrom's work and all the folks who've been working with her and have been inspired by her have basically established that community-based management is often very effective, as is having polycentric systems where you have different communities responsible for different parts of that common pool resource. So having a community responsible for a resource can be really effective. The issue, of course, is when you have a really big resource that multiple communities can access, it gets much harder to have successful collective action. This is because, of course, the more folks you add, the harder it is to actually, say, monitor what people are doing. The harder it is to actually feel like your behavior will impact somebody else. It's so diffuse, right, in that larger system. The thing about these communities, though, is that, of course, there are connections between them. There are often long distance relationships, which sometimes for shorthand in this context, I'll call between community relationships, just to keep things easy. So if individuals are managing risk via long distance relationships, they may have a vested interest in what's happening in the community down the road, right? That's because, of course, if things go rough for your household, if you're experiencing a shortfall, a sudden shock, then oftentimes you're going to be relying on these folks down the road. So their outcomes are going to matter for you. Additionally, long distance relationships may improve monitoring, right? Being able to keep track of behavior in these other communities through those connections that you have. And this may make it easier to have this large scale collective action without necessarily having effective institutions, right? Institutions that actually monitor behavior and mete out punishment are something that we know really matter for collective action. But if you have these long distance relationships, that can be another way to say, increase monitoring and reduce uncertainty about what's happening in places down the road. So the question then is, do long distance relationships make successful management of large common pool resources more likely? So there are multiple study systems in which we can investigate this question, but fisheries, coastal fisheries, offer an interesting study system for investigating this. So fisheries are difficult to manage, notoriously so, because sometimes they're very large, right? If you actually zoom out far enough, they're the whole planet, right? But boundaries are porous with fisheries. You don't really have clear demarcations often on the landscape when you're out on the water. And fish move around. Certain species move around more than others. If you're actually going for octopus, for example, on the Tanzanian coast, they don't move around so much, but other pelagic fish are moving a ton. So in addition, let me skip forward and then I'll get back to that other part. Monitoring these large areas can be very expensive and time consuming. And it's hard to catch people who are actually breaking the rules. So there are lots of suggestions for how to make this work better. One is to say, of course, establish boundaries using GPS, using buoys, ways to demarcate what is in a fishery and what is outside, who is and isn't a user, so like permitting systems, for example, and user rights, where fishers get to fish. Is there a little area that is a recovery zone within that fishery, for example? These are things that you can do. Further, when it comes to monitoring, it helps to have clear roles about who's in charge of monitoring with sufficient compensation to actually have folks out there doing that work and not accepting bribes. And they need to be locally based, right? Able to actually see what's happening. So we know these things work. Effective institutions work. It also helps if folks have minimal variation in the benefits they stand to gain from fisheries. And of course, per work that Sergey's done before and that Pete's done before, it helps to have motivated leaders in terms of Olsen effects, right? You can have the rising tide raising all boats. I guess the pun here is unintended. If you have a leader who's willing to kind of pull extra weight, right? There's a lot of benefit to them. But these can be a tall order. So for example, if we're looking at where we want to place a new initiative for fisheries management, can it help to look at existing social relationships? Maybe those are also important for actually fostering effective management. So to study this, what we're doing is taking advantage of a quasi-natural experiment that's happening now on the mainland coast of Tanzania. This is in collaboration with Monique Bergerhoff-Mulder, whom many of you know, and also with Chris Smith, my postdoc, who's actually in Tanzania right now. So on the Tanzanian coast, you have nested structures for managing fisheries. Again, something that tends to work well for resource management. So first you have a beach management unit where you actually have a landing site and it has a fishery associated with it. Here, of course, fisheries can mean many different things. It can be the folks who are engaging in the fishing plus the actual physical space. Sometimes you might say fisheries are different for the different species of fish that are out there. But here what it means is that there's basically a delineated space off the coast that is associated with the landing site. Usually there's one or more villages who's associated with this beach management unit. And there's an executive committee of users who actually run the beach management unit. Now, what's happening now on the Tanzanian coast is there's increasingly organization into these collaborative fisheries management areas, or CFMAs. This is something that was piloted earlier on Lake Victoria and has been used on the Tanzanian coast since the late 90s, early 2000s. So CFMAs are contiguous, that is in space, physically contiguous BMUs, and they have a coordinating committee that enacts management plans that then the individual BMUs actually implement. So some CFMAs, as I mentioned, were created earlier in time, say in the early 2000s. We're going to be studying these folks. Some of them continue today and have been successful. Others have been disbanded, and some of them have reorganized. Of course, now we also have other folks who are now joining the fray. So the entire mainland Tanzanian coast is now broken up into CFMAs, and they are now finalizing their management plans, these brand new CFMAs, which offers an interesting opportunity for us. So for these older CFMAs, why are they working well or are they not working well? Are long distance relationships or other candidate predictors, things like effective institutions, for example, are these predictors of successful collective action? This is something we can do through interviews, and we're getting at this mostly qualitatively. And for newer CFMAs, do having more or higher strength, that is, for example, more trusting, more frequent contact, LDRs, long distance relationships at baseline, predict individual level contributions to collective action at the delay of 1 year. Hopefully at the delay of more than 1 year, but of course the funding window is short. So we hope to actually check this further out in time too. And I should mention we're collaborating with a number of different stakeholders in the area, including 4 local NGOs to study this. Okay, so bringing it all together, what are long distance relationships and when do we humans have them? So humans have been doing long distance relationships for a long time, and this includes things like risk pooling between communities, exchange, and mobility, where you may maintain a connection at a distance and will actually go to them when times get rough. Yet long distance relationships are often not studied as a distinct phenomenon, as a distinct part of human sociality in the social sciences, or much less in biology, if we happen to be looking at humans over in that side of things. So intergroup ties, and long distance ties are all distinct. They can be overlapping, but they do different things. I have a preprint here at the end of the talk that'll be linked, you can check out, that actually pulls apart intergroup ties from long distance ties. So long distance relationships, as I established, thinking about just the costs and benefits, should be a common cultural adaptation when risk is locally correlated, whether spatially, of course, locally correlated, or temporally, has a large characteristic scale. So folks are affected over a big span of space. And when these risks of, say, resource shortfalls are not so rare, right? When you tend to have a fatter tail than I actually have in this distribution over here on the right-hand side. Long distance relationships are relevant to climate change adaptation. They have been in the past. They probably will be in the future too, and likely also to resource management. So long distance relationships alter network structure, which actually affects the way that innovations move through networks. And that's going to affect the way that climate change adaptation, which is something we're very interested in right now, is going to be transmitted across different communities. And long distance relationships may promote collective action around large resources like fisheries and forests and watersheds and grasslands, above and beyond the known predictors that are so common for study in the economic literature, in the political science literature, and in the development sector. So stay tuned. We will have more on that as the empirical data roll in. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, even though I can't see you. Hopefully we'll hear from you here during the Q&A. Thanks to our funders. The preprint I mentioned here is at the bottom if you'd like to take a look. And if you'd like to know more about me or follow me on Twitter, those links are there that you can, well, they're not links, you can type them in on the right-hand side. All right, I'll take your questions, thanks.
Thank you very much for that great talk, Anne. Yeah, very, very interesting stuff. So you mentioned your preprint there. We've had another question in the Q&A regarding the Pisor and Jones 2021 paper that's in press. Is that the one that's in Journal of Human Biology now?
Yes, so we have a special issue. I'm trying to find you. I will. I hope everyone got the QR code. If not, or QR code, I should say, if not, grab it now. And then I'm going to stop sharing. You can, of course, get my slides later on the website. So we have a special issue on climate change adaptation in humans in the American Journal of Human Biology, which came out about 3 or 4 months ago now. And so, yes, there are 2 different Pisor and Jones papers in there. And the one that is Pisor and Jones focusing on whether long distance relationships are important for managing responses to climate change, that's the one that I'm mostly mentioning here.
Okay, fantastic. So just to say, we had a couple of questions in the Q&A. I'll just give people a few more minutes to add some questions. I'll start off with one question. So it's about the nature of these long distance relationships, and are they often kin-based, which we know can help with cooperation? And if they're not, are there also, do these tend to be kind of fairly reciprocal relationships? Are they kind of balanced in terms of, people have to do something for each other in order to maintain those relationships?
Yeah. So are they kin-based? The answer is often yes. Of course, it's cheaper to actually forge long distance relationships when you have kin who are there. And of course, if we're thinking about Bernard Chapet's work, I mean, this might have been the quintessential ways in terms of intergroup relationships to lower the costs of potential conflict through actually having affinal relationships. And then you can use those affinal relationships to access things like resources. For those of you who don't know, affinal relationships are just marriage ties. And so that there kind of brings me into the segue about thinking about institutions. So there's lots of evidence that humans have created institutions to reduce the cost of long distance relationships and of intergroup relationships. This is where the 2 are pretty closely related. And so marriage is one way to do that, building kin. Another way to do that is through things like fictive kin relationships, or having specific ritualized relationships like for Haro relationships for the San, having those kinds of exchange relationships that are ritualized. Trobriand Islands, another good example, are ways to have access to things that are non-local. And so humans have been doing this lots of different ways, and which I think is bringing me to the second part of your question. Am I on track?
Yes, yeah. But it's
okay.
kind of the more balanced reciprocity type of thing.
Right, and so how balanced is it? That's right. So the literature would suggest that, of course, when there's lower trust, which there often is across a distance, you have fewer of those mutual ties to help you with monitoring, that you should have more immediate reciprocity. And so one of my favorite papers that tackles something like this is a paper by Katie Demps and Bruce Winterhalter from 2018 that looks at the emergence of markets. And of course, when you have markets emerging, you often have instantaneous trade as a way to get things off the ground. And then as a relationship becomes more trusting in the sense that you actually expect someone to reciprocate, then you can actually have longer and longer delays in reciprocity. Having institutions should lower the cost of that as well, so you can move to those delays sooner. But the question of whether or not long distance relationships are really marked by this immediacy versus this tolerance of delay, how much do they look, for example, like local friendships, where you'll be very tolerant of delay versus, these kind of more immediate exchanges, is something that Chris Smith and I are really interested in. And so we're trying to collect empirical data on that too.
Yeah. I guess one of the things I'm thinking about is in East Africa, pastoralists, where I'm doing fieldwork at the moment, where they're not necessarily immediately reciprocated, these relationships, but because of the variable nature of the environment, people know that they're going to have to repay a favor. So, yeah.
Stock friends, I feel like, are a quintessential example of long distance relationships, so important for pastoralists.
Fantastic. Okay, let's go to the Q&A, and then we'll come to the panel in a minute. So we've got a question from Burton Voorheers, who asks, given a group of N communities with LDR connections monitoring a common resource, is there a relationship between the number of individuals connected by LDR and the quantity and quality of information exchanged required to manage the resource? And he's thinking about if there's an optimal arising from issues of information overload.
Overload, interesting. So you would expect it kind of a U-shaped relationship here. So I confess that I've been thinking, if this is a U-shaped relationship, I've been thinking mostly about the left-hand side of the U, in the sense that as you have more long-distance relationships between communities, there's more information transfer, which should lower the costs of collective action, not only because you have more vested interests in that community. Each individual has maybe a partner over there and they care about what happens to that partner for risk management, but additionally because monitoring becomes much cheaper. Now, this idea that there might be something coming down on the other side, information overload, let me just take what you're saying, and I'm hoping I'm getting it here. One could have swamping effects, especially if you're thinking about peripheral groups, right, on the edges of a larger core intersocial network. Those can really easily be swamped. This is Damien Santola's work. I'm pulling on that from UPenn, where you can actually have this core swamp the periphery with their cultural adaptations, right? There's just so many connections that they're just coming in and they're replacing local, often traditional ecological knowledge, right? And this is commonly happening. It's even being brokered by development organizations as they're trying to move these innovations that have come from Western countries into subsistence communities, and it's displacing their own traditional ecological knowledge. So maybe that's the U-shape, and I think that's a good point, that these two things actually fit together. Maybe in the Q&A, in the little box, you can tell us whether I answered your question.
Okay, brilliant. So we go to the next talk, next question. So Dan Hoyer is wondering about the downsides to LDRs, which is, I guess, following on from what we've just been talking about. Can these interactions also lead to conflict by bringing competitors into contact, looking for the same connections or payoffs within a region or a network?
Yes. So an interesting thing about LDRs is if you're thinking about institutions, you can often see two things happening. So first of all, if long distance relationships or intergroup relationships, again, this is where they're kind of similar. They can be both pretty beneficial and have institutions that are reinforcing them. But you can also have institutions that are curtailing them, especially for local partners. You can think about whether, if there actually is a trade-off between whether you can invest in local partners versus non-local partners, that means that local partners may actually be hurt if you're investing more in long distance relationships. So there's a lot of literatures that are getting really close to this idea, thinking about, for example, Casper and Bergerhoff-Mulder. I think it's the 2016 paper. When you start having folks who are more participating in market economies, they often will stop investing in their local connections, and that can lead folks locally to be pretty mad about the situation. So this is also something you see looking at pastoralists, especially with folks. I'm thinking, I don't want to strike out on who it is, so I won't try. But in Africa, you'll often see institutions curtailing long distance relationships because it may mean that you're actually not investing in the local group. And when you have a lot of interethnic conflict, especially over access to cattle, this can be an issue. So you do see institutions actually coming out and curtailing long distance relationships. And that can be one of the costs that actually prevents LDRs from forming. So even if humans are interested in this, of course, that's in a perfect world. There's a difference between what Chris and I call a long distance orientation, so being interested in forming these long distance relationships, and your ability to actually make it happen. If folks want more information on that, I do have one of my extra slides that I can share the screen if you want to think about the difference between motivation for long distance relationships and the ability to actually form them. Hopefully I didn't get too off track. Hopefully I answered your question. Fingers crossed.
Just had a follow-up to the previous question who just said, yes, I think they answered the question. And they're just thinking about things like social networks today when we get lots of information. I think so there's a general point about, sometimes you get lots of information coming in from all different sources, as we know all too well in the modern world. Okay, we'll go to a question from the panel. And Nathan, you've got your hand up.
Sure. Great. I really enjoyed the talk. So I've two questions, which are more speculative, but since you're an expert, I'm curious about your thoughts. So one is about, you've shown clearly long distance relationships, there's benefits in terms of smoothing risk and dealing with things like climate change shocks. And so if we think of the current world, one fact about it is if anything's limited, it's mobility or movement of labor. So goods are free, but people can't move across. So if we thought of, we were talking about pastoralists within the Sahel region, they move frequently across borders, and not to mention people wanting to move to the US and even movement within countries like China. So, you know, given all these benefits, if labor can't move, are there other strategies, or how terrible is it that labor can't move in our more than it does in our current environment? So curious about that. And then just the second question is about, you mentioned good institutions for common pool resource management. And so I'm just curious about if you've thought about what are the good institutions. So, you know, things like often economists or others will say property rights, you need private property rights, or we need to conserve land, so we have conservation lands. But again, returning to the pastoralist example, that actually causes a lot of problems for these transhuman pastoralists who migrate seasonally. Now this land has been privatized and they can't use it like they traditionally have, or conservation lands where you're not allowed to graze. And so in that case, it's unclear, are those the good institutions, which some people might think, you know, this is what we need to conserve land, or is it something else? Or yeah, so I'm curious if you had any thoughts on those two big picture questions.
Yeah, so movement, of course, is not necessary for long distance relationships, particularly now when you have access to things like social media, WhatsApp. It's been a game changer globally, right? So in the past, it really helped to be able to go and visit someone. Sometimes you'll also often see, and I won't go too far down this rabbit hole, but the evolution of middlemen, when you're talking about both long distance relationships and intergroup relationships, folks who are acting as a go-between, because the cost of going to visit is a huge opportunity cost from, say, investing in your own crops. If you're growing crops, you have a risk of dying if you encounter strangers, things like that. So movement, of course, is just one of the 6 main strategies that I highlighted for managing climate risk. And if, you know, 3 of those at the bottom, one of them is movement, but of course you also see things like exchange, which don't actually have to involve anything more than brief contact and then coming home. Movement, of course, is really important, particularly for pastoralists. I can tell that you have kind of a pastoralist bent here, which is very welcome here. So is it bad that folks can't move? Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's bad. You know, the politics of borders is a whole nother thing, which I won't go too far into here, but humans, for responding to risk for all of our evolutionary history, I won't even say a very long time, the whole time, have needed movement to be able to access resources and to be able to make things work. And that is, even though it doesn't happen frequently for intensive agriculturalists, was still even important then, right? So is it bad that labor can't move? Yeah, I mean, I think it is. It means that we have to find other ways to make things work. And as you can see, a lot of times, I think it's just cobbling things together to try to deal with the fact that labor can't move. And that means goods have to move, but then goods are also, as we know right now, not moving very efficiently either. Anyway, rabbit hole, I won't go too far down. With respect to institutions, what works best and how does that maybe intersect with long distance relationships? So you made the point that, for example, giving property rights is something that's commonly recommended, but does not work well for pastoralists on the Sahel, because you need to be able to move if you're transhuman to where those resources are. Property rights for pastoralists in general just kind of doesn't work out so well. I think the issue here is that we shouldn't paint with broad brushstrokes. What works well in one place is not going to work well for another. And this is why, again, whether we're thinking about resource management or even thinking more broadly about responses to climate change, is that if we think that we can come with that broad brush and come in and say, well, this is what's working really well here, it should work well here as well, we're often misguided. I think that folks in the development world are often doing their best trying to figure that out. But oftentimes folks are just not asking communities or not doing enough work on the ground to figure out what's going to work before they're throwing money at a problem. And I'm not the first person to say this. You know, folks have been saying this for decades. But I think the issue there is the broad brush. We have maybe a suite of things we know work well, like property rights, polycentric systems, having folks on the ground who can monitor whether folks are using as they should be. But we need a different constellations of things in different places, and actually asking communities what's going to work for them is a good start. Did I answer your questions?
Yep, that's great. So yeah. Thank you.
Brilliant, yes. Pete.
Great talk, and I thought of these ideas would apply to the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene, from the last ice age to the present, because during the last ice age, there was really crazy climate variation, and all of a sudden, at the beginning of the Holocene, that largely disappeared. Not to say that there isn't temporal variation in the Holocene, and now climate change threatens to increase the need to cope with temporal change. So my picture of it is, to a first approximation, last ice age people were preoccupied with coping with climate change, and in the Holocene, people have been preoccupied with fine-grained adaptations to local environments, and this is seems to be reflected in the size of ethnic groups. So in the last ice age, this well understood Gravettian phenomenon was essentially the whole of Europe seems to have been one ethnic group. And in the Holocene, we get these little tiny ethnic groups, relatively speaking, in terms of their geographical scale, not in terms of their total head count, but in terms of their geographical scale. So that sounds just like what you're talking about, that during the Gravettian, people had to maintain dramatically long-distance relationships to cope with the climate change. In the Holocene, many of those were dropped, and even would be, in terms of fine-grained adaptations to local environments, long-term ties are a risk of importing bad ideas from a different environment, rather than I've worked on that problem. So we get this really spectacular difference in the kind of the social shape of the world over that. Do you think that's a reasonable interpretation? Have you talked to any archaeologists or paleoanthropologists about that?
Not about that exact topic. It does remind me, of course, of Dan Nettles' work thinking about the size of ethno-linguistic groups based on the kinds of risks that they're trying to manage, where you need a common language, of course, if you're managing risk. Whether or not you need it, of course, in actuality, not necessarily. Folks often make things work. That's interesting, food for thought. I mean, everything I've seen would suggest that you're probably correct, right? That when you have the grain matters, and when you have finer scale grain of variation, that you can have more specialization, that folks can just kind of stay put and don't necessarily need the connections as much. But I think even the gradient of movement we see in terms of what folks are up to around the equator, it looks a little bit different as well. So my first principal response is yes, that seems very reasonable, but no, I haven't talked to folks too much about it beyond reading their work. I haven't actually delved in any further. Right,
the polar latitude sort of diversity gradient runs a bit from environments in the far away from the equator that are temporally more variable than ones close to the equator. That's a good observation.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you for that.
I will come to you in a second, Monique, but there's a question on the Q&A that relates to this. So it's so it's a question that says, so one of the first things Napoleon would offer after conquering new territory would to make French the official language and teach locals French. So I guess more generally, what's the role of language in long-term relationships?
Good question. So of course, to actually make things work, sharing a language really helps. In terms of getting things off the ground initially, we know from exchange that you often don't need to have a shared relationship. You can do it without language, or you often see pigeons emerge, right, where folks have a few shared words for making exchange work. So the actual frontier of exchange is often where you see new languages emerging. So do you need a shared language? Yes. Is it crucial to getting things off the ground at the beginning if we're actually thinking, instead of just looking at a cross section, but thinking about how things are changing through time, how you get those long distance relationships off the ground? You don't necessarily need them, at least at the outset. So hopefully that answers your question. Yes, it does help. And it does speak to Pete's question as well about ethnic groups, if we're thinking about ethno-linguistic groups.
Monique.
Hi, Anne. Great talk.
Thank you.
I've just come out of 2 days, another 3 days of the Royal Anthropological Institute Conservation and Anthropology conference. And had they heard your talk, they would raise something that actually was, I don't think you mentioned, though I have to admit it's been cutting out a bit, but local adaptations, getting things right is often locally specific. What's right in one place is not right somewhere else. And I mean, you gave the example of Casper and my work in Pimbway. Those rich families, by imitating what's going on in town and wearing town clothes, they're really getting into trouble and having resources kind of taken away from them. But more generally, and back to the sort of RAI conference, a lot of ideas that come from outside international conservation organizations are really, really inappropriate. And I mean, and we know that, of course, they should be listening locally, but of course, your work is talking the other way. It's talking from the communities, the advantage they get from reaching out and getting information and contacts far away. I'm a little bit worried you're not considering enough the dangers of these outside links.
Yes. So by dangers of outside links, one thing you can get is swamping. From outside links, leading to, say, other cultural innovations coming in and swapping what's happening locally. Am I starting to answer your question? If so, I'll keep talking.
Yes, I only get 2 words out of 3, so okay, I will nod. But
yes, okay, so I'll keep going that direction then. So this also came up earlier in the Q&A, and it's a good question. It's something that we actually tackle in Jones, Reddy, and Pisor in that AJHB special issue, which if there's a quiet moment, I'll drop the link in, but hopefully y'all can find it. So there's a point in which you have so many connections, or if you have those connections that are very strong, and they can be strong for a number of reasons. There's a lot of interaction happening between 2 nodes that are spanning, say, a peripheral group with a core group. It can also happen because of prestige bias transmission, which I think you're alluding to a little bit here in terms of adopting things from market communities, where you actually get a swamping effect. So you can have local adaptations that are emerging, but they're getting swamped by movement through the connections folks have. And of course, the swamping can be made a heck of a lot worse by the development sector if they're coming in and saying, this is the adaptation you're going to use, right? So they're bringing in their own innovation and basically assigning it to a community. What, as you know, and other folks probably do as well, it's called often a top-down approach or kind of a technocratic solution. So can that crowd out what's happening locally? Absolutely, it is a serious issue. I actually have an in-prep piece with Team 1 from the climate change groups that I mentioned earlier that we'll be submitting soon. It's an opinion piece that actually gives the 5 ways that we should change our thinking about climate change adaptation and be paying more attention to the bottom up, or at least meeting in the middle, where there's co-production of knowledge rather than development organizations assigning communities the adaptations that they're going to use. I hope that I answered your question, even if it was 2 words out of 3. Let me know.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you said, but it's not just swamping, it's actually wrong information, because some adaptations are appropriate to one place.
Exactly.
We think about this in biodiversity conservation all the time, the importance of local adaptations, even local behavioral adaptations, and they may be lost with these kinds of long ties.
Very good point. I see Jamie's actually here, so we'll have to let him weigh in too. But yes, so the swamping effect is a serious concern. And again, it's like, if we think that not all organizations are doing that, I don't want to paint with a broad brushstroke on that. However, if we think that we know what's right for a community and we haven't actually done our due diligence about coming in and asking them what works or seeing what works, then we are potentially introducing the wrong adaptation, the thing that's not going to work locally. And what's worse is that wastes time, because that means that's time that they could have spent potentially working with something they already had been using and maybe modifying it and seeing if they can still make it work, or learning from other communities through horizontal ties. Or it's also, a waste of money if we're throwing money at something and it's not going to work. I hope I'm still on the right track, Monique, but feel free to respond.
Yeah, no, great, fantastic, thanks. Bye.
Yeah, no problem. Bye.
With a quick question of my own there. So a lot of the time in these systems, societies, traditional societies would be, adapting to these things in certain ways, right? So again, I'm thinking about East Africa here, pastoralists moving around. Those options are often being constrained now through things that we've talked about, kind of states assigning certain areas that people are supposed to be going to, or there's development, erecting fences and things like that. So, I mean, to what extent is that going to play into your data collection for your project? So to what extent are you looking at how constraints are affecting people and they're going forward with their climate adaptations, or to what extent are you going to try and think about removing those constraints and allowing more traditional forms of adaptation?
Well, of course, removing is.
I know you can't
one
do
can
that.
dream. One can dream. One of the things I think that's important to get at here, and I think this may be to your point, is in my work, what I also often like to pull apart is the difference between someone's preference for something. So the difference between, if you ask them, given their druthers, what would they like to do versus what they can actually do. And I think one of the reasons that that's important is that it also gives you a little bit of insight into human psychology, right? So if there's actually, say, an evolved psychology that's a product of all of the risk management we've been doing for such a long time, we may see that folks actually have the kind of itch to say, build a long distance relationship, and they're not really sure why, but they'd really like to do it. And so one of the things that in the project with Monique and Chris that we're focused on, and Jamie and I will have to talk more, but I'm thinking about importing it over there too, is actually asking folks questions that get at their preferences separately from what they're actually able to do. And the important thing there is to kind of try to disentangle the reality of it, which of course folks are often not able to move when they would like to move, from what would they would actually prefer to do. And those preferences, they might be able to verbalize them, so you can ask them what they'd like to do and they say it, but you may also see behaviors that kind of reflect that as proxies that folks can't verbalize as well. So maybe like a wanderlust is something Chris and I have been talking about. You have the desire to go out and explore and to meet people and see what they're up to, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're able to do that. So asking questions in different ways that enable folks to both talk about what their preferences are, and actually the realizations of those preferences are important to disentangle given the constraints, given that I'm pretty sure it's clear at this point that pastoralists really need to not be constrained by private property to make it work, but it doesn't seem like it's changing anytime soon, right?
No, brilliant. We'll go ahead to Leslie's waiting patiently on the Q&A. So asking, have you looked at pre-industrial communications technology, such as drums, beacon fires, smoke signals, etc.?
Have I done that? No, I haven't. One of the things that I find really interesting, and is it Ross and Atkinson? I can't remember. It's Ross and someone, but there's a couple really elegant examples of the transmission of myths, for example, oral traditions that one can trace. And there's this really nice one that you can see these myths actually moving around the Arctic Circle. And so it's really clear that folks have been in contact with each other, and you can see that there has been at least movement of peoples through migration, if not long distance relationships. Humans are really good at both. Again, that movement through migration is often happening through long distance relationships. But in terms of, fires also, I think there's some really nice examples from Australia of message sticks. I'm going to start striking out here, so I'll stop while I'm ahead. There's some cool examples of how that's happening, but no, I have not looked into it.
I think we'll have one final question from the Q&A. So Peter Compo is asking, is the term adaptation appropriate to describe top-down techniques for solving local problems? So arguing that adaptation implies things coming from the bottom up.
Do I think it's appropriate? Nope, I don't. So in the development literature, folks are often talking about adaptation, usually in the context of climate change adaptation. Let's see which paper. It's in one of, again, Jamie's here, he can help me out, but it's in one of the many Jones-Pisor combos from that special issue. But what's often happening is that folks in the development sector are talking about adaptation, and they just mean change in response to or anticipation of climate change. Evolutionary theorists would usually stop you right there and say, in anticipation is not something we usually see when it comes to adaptation. Adaptations are responses. We can't, evolution by natural selection cannot predict the future, right? And select an adaptation that will work well in that future. So already I would say inappropriate right there. And then of course, is it reasonable to think about adaptations as something that can be seeded from the top down? That gets a little bit more sticky. Of course, these are all candidate adaptations until they've actually been tried out. So that's why we probably use the word innovation at that point. But when it comes to actually being an adaptation, it has to work well, right? It has to either be good at promoting itself, or if we're thinking from the human perspective, it has to work well for us. So can a top-down introduced innovation become an adaptation? It could, just like anything else could through cultural transmission. However, calling it an adaptation from the outset, I think, is misguided. And I think that gets at your question.
Well, I'll let you go there. I think, Anne, that was a fantastic talk and some very full answers to lots of great questions. And thank you, everybody, for those fantastic questions. A really good discussion. We're going to have our talk next week from Timothy Njagi, joining us from Kenya next week. Continuing on our theme of, we ended up talking about pastoralists a lot there. Tim will be talking more about his work on evolution and sustainability of pastoralist production systems based on comparative stuff in East Africa and South America. Just be aware for those countries who are going to be changing their clocks this weekend, the time might be slightly different for you guys because the states don't change their clocks until a week after, I think. But that's enough promoting for next week. Thank you once again. Anne, Sergey, do you want to come in there?
Thank you, Anne. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. And we hope to see everybody next week. The slides and videos will go up on the website soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.